One of EY's recent studies found that bribery and corrupt practices present the greatest risk to the long-term success of businesses in emerging markets. We've seen since the pandemic how individuals and companies alike have pushed their luck even further and expanded their corrupt networks. Poor governance structures in many African countries are creating opportunities for potential abuse of economic stimulus programs, initiatives to assist vulnerable groups, and procurement of PPEs, vaccinations, and public health goods. So where's the 500 million allocated to the COVID-19 relief? Where did it go? We've witnessed firsthand how certain individuals are in it for themselves to the detriment of the country and the continent. We see articles weekly, if not daily. It's becoming a way of life. People aren't even shocked anymore by this type of behavior. But the public are getting very tired and their patience is running out. In some countries, citizens have even started taking matters into their own hands. Corruption is said to be on the rise, but for how long? Looking at the consequences and accountability, we have seen how, for example, in South Africa, some positive progress has been made in identifying and starting to make individuals accountable for their actions. Examples of these include proclamations to the SIU, an increase in them, especially in relation to the COVID corruption, the Zondo Commission into state capture, setting up an investigative directorate at the National Prosecuting Authority, and enhancing the powers of the Auditor General. We also look forward to the continued efforts all of us at this conference make on a daily basis. The roles that the forensic practitioner that CFEs play now and in the future is going to be critical in disrupting corruption. So to set the scene for our discussion, we are going to play a short clip, which, as I said, was produced by The Economist and sponsored by EY. The film is part of the Disruptor series that has tackled human trafficking and financial crime, visited smart cities and renewable energy pioneers, and looked into the impact of a driverless future. The series further explores the pressures of change confronting modern-day society and reveals some of the biggest and most powerful disruptive forces already starting to shape our future. The theme is disrupting corruption.
Corrosive. Catastrophic.
People feel there is no hope.
And often covert. Corruption costs the world nearly $3 trillion every year and blights the lives of hundreds of millions. But in some parts of the world, there's a renewed drive to disrupt corruption.
We need to act with urgency and purpose to restore our state-owned enterprises.
From bold moves at the top,
we've got to make sure that there's strong, committed, ethical leadership,
to new technologies shining a light on the problem.
Now in Ukraine, we have the most transparent corruption in the world.
Communities, companies and countries are learning lessons in how to root out corruption.
Our country changed to one of the obvious technological leaders.
Hold the guilty to account.
This was one of the largest cases the SFO had worked on.
And challenge the culture that allows it to continue.
Do we accept the way it is, or do you stand up for something?
So yes, the million-dollar question, how exactly do we disrupt corruption? Let's get into some detail. But before we commence with the panel discussion, I would like to briefly share some key insights from EY's recently released Global Integrity Report and the Emerging Markets Perspective Report, also about integrity. So last year, EY compiled a Global Integrity Report. We interviewed about 3,000 employees from organizations in 33 countries and territories worldwide. After that, we surveyed another 1,700 executives in 21 emerging market countries. 205 of them come from Africa, based in West Africa, Nigeria, East Africa, Kenya, and South Africa or Southern Africa. We call this the Emerging Markets Report. So what is interesting from the findings of the Global Integrity Report was that it was noted that in times of crisis, personal conduct can be the first standard to slip. And those surveyed are of the opinion that bribery and corrupt practices present the greatest risk to the long-term success of business. The report further flagged that integrity is more important today than it has ever been. So a consideration for us to all think about: is this the moment for Africa to prioritize integrity? Is this the moment for Africa to disrupt corruption? The COVID-19 pandemic has had a significant impact on businesses across the globe. This is no different to organizations operating in countries in Africa. One may very well argue that Africa has been especially hard hit, with some countries expecting its economy to contract, being largest shrinkage in nearly 90 years. So business leaders have faced widespread disruption to their operations, supply chain, and workforce, which has magnified the risk of unethical conduct and non-compliance with laws and regulations. 53% of respondents in Africa, if you look at the slide, say that maintaining standards of integrity during rapid change is a significant challenge. 63% of emerging market respondents felt the same way. 32% of emerging market respondents said bribery and corruption present the greatest risk to the long-term success of their businesses. However, in Africa, our respondents rated a lot higher, over 40%, with Kenya being at 56% and Nigeria and South Africa being at 40% and 35%. Percent of respondents rating this as a significant risk. Something else to think about: in December 2020, a global market research agency, Ipsos, conducted a survey on what worries the world. South Africa was the only country in Africa that took part in this survey. In South Africa, the 3 topics which the respondents found the most worrying in the country were ranked as follows. Number 1, financial or political corruption. Number 2, unemployment, and then only number 3, COVID. Very different from the rest of the world's rankings. So just over 1/4 of emerging market respondents point to fraud as posing the greatest risk to long-term success of the organization. In Africa, it is much higher, averaging 38%. Furthermore, 38% of respondents in Africa believe that the risk of cyber and ransomware attack is a significant threat. And you just have to see some of the cyber attacks that we've recently gone through to see that this risk is actually becoming a reality. So given this, organizations in emerging markets, including those operating on the continent of Africa, should consider 4 key areas or pillars to address increased risk and minimize misconduct. In other words, to disrupt corruption. The first key area is management should prioritize business integrity. The second key area is that organizations should build an effective whistleblowing program. And the third key area is the cyber and data privacy framework should be strengthened. Lastly, a robust third-party due diligence program should be in place. So in summary, some of the key findings from an emerging markets perspective: the pressure on emerging markets has intensified, fueled by the COVID-19 pandemic. Despite rising enforcement, fraud and corruption continue to be a major threat to the long-term success of businesses. Regulatory scrutiny and remote working following the pandemic is aggravating these issues. However, the report shows that businesses in emerging markets are making a concerted effort to proactively reduce misconduct and drive compliance and integrity. So with this in mind, I'm very keen to discuss with Caleb and Linus on how and if organizations are keeping their integrity agenda strong, and to hear some insights regarding the trends they're seeing across the African continent, both pre-COVID and during the pandemic. And of course, any additional concerns that have been brought about by political or social unrest in many of our African countries. So Caleb, we have noted that companies are continuing to shift their fraud and corruption strategies from being very reactive to being more proactive. We've also noticed that there's a stronger drive for some of these initiatives, as mentioned on the slide. What do you think the reasons for this shift in thinking could be?
Good question, Sharon. What we have seen is that business leaders across the globe have come to understand that integrity is a cornerstone of building a better working world. They are now starting to understand that designing and implementing a strong ethics framework is core to ensuring good corporate governance and allows them to proactively identify, assess, and mitigate against unacceptable behaviors. We have also noted that a successful organization is one that stays true to its mission, keeps its promises, its employees respect laws and ethical norms, and has found a way to foster public trust in how they go about doing their business. However, organizations that are only focused on reacting once problems have occurred normally find themselves on the short end of the stick, resulting in money being lost, reputations being damaged, and business operations being interrupted. The reason why is because they have not found a way and a mechanism to influence behaviors, cultures within their organizations and also with their stakeholders. Companies that view integrity as a key factor in their success can more confidently operate in high-risk environments and navigate new markets. They are able to freely innovate new solutions and processes as they have a strong ethical foundation and have made integrity and transparency imperative in dealing with their business partners and stakeholders. Successful industry leaders are those that have found a way of balancing ambitious business goals with resulting risks. Those that understand how performance pressures, attitudes, and cultures influence employee actions find it much easier to anticipate corruption and fraud risks. In addition to that, they have found ways to assess ethical risks in their environment and adapt their compliance programs to make sure that it effectively manages some of those risks that have been identified.
So a part of proactive measures is definitely whistleblowing. So there's no doubt that employees should be encouraged to blow the whistle on misconduct. It's imperative that businesses make employees feel that they can safely report misconduct without fear of occupational detriment, and doing so is in the best interest of the organization. So it's concerning, if you look at the slide, that in countries such as Kenya and South Africa, respondents cite concerns about personal safety and future career prospects as reasons not to report. Maybe this shouldn't be surprising given the publicity around cases of whistleblowers not being afforded adequate protection when blowing the whistle on high-profile corruption taking place at government, state-owned entities, and even private sector entities. Also, concerns that nothing will be done about speaking out is another factor that organizations operating in this geography will need to address. Caleb, given these discouraging numbers, in practice, are you seeing any areas of improvement with regards to the whistleblowing mechanisms and how we can make them more effective and make individuals with more reporting more comfortable with the reporting? And have you noticed a difference post and pre the pandemic?
With regards to improvements in the whistleblowing mechanism or the operation of such mechanism, one has to look at two elements. Firstly, one is to look at the function of the whistleblowing mechanism itself. And secondly, one is to look at how management or leaders in the company actually promote such mechanism and enforce trust in people using it. Now, with regards to improvements, with regards to the whistleblowing function itself, on the technology side, what we've seen a lot of companies around the world doing is that they've now actually built applications within their own ecosystems that allow employees, external parties, and other business partners to be able to blow the whistle in the comfort of their own environment and space. And furthermore, what this also has done is that, not only has it limited the cost of actually providing such services, but it also, has made sure that this is reachable using the company's existing networks. However, obviously, there are some people that do not have access to such technology. Some people do not have access to computers, for example. And this is where you see in the same entities the emergence of old technologies that are now repurposed to actually fulfill this gap. For example, what we've seen is that the use of USSD technology, this is now old technology that has existed since the beginning of cell phones have been in use, where people can use their phones, doesn't even have to be a smartphone, to actually work through a menu and report report issues that need to be investigated. And this is even more accessible to everybody. You don't even need to have a computer or a smartphone to do that. And what also companies have done proactively is now making use of applications such as WhatsApp, for example, which is now commonly used as a tool to communicate. They've built or implemented WhatsApp platforms where people can use this technology to report issues and decide whether they want to be anonymous or be able to be reached. In addition to the technology element of improving a whistleblowing mechanism, what we've also seen is that some of the traditional elements still remain strong. For example, traditionally entities have normally, performed whistleblowing awareness campaigns within their own environment, meaning that it's limited to their employees, not even service providers or contractors in that regard. Those that are maturing within their fraud risk management programs have extended those not only to their internal environment, but also to include contractors that normally do business with those entities, to their service providers that render services, and also business partners that are partners in some business ventures. And using technology, particularly in this day and age, has made it even more accessible to reach those people that traditionally you would not have been able to reach. Virtual meetings and so on, spending a minute or two talking about the effectiveness and the effect of fraud and corruption within businesses and what the company policy is goes a long way in actually making sure that this thing works. And we've seen it now when you look at post and pre-pandemic environments, leading to what we're actually seeing in this day and age. What we're seeing is that during the pandemic environment, there have been some structural changes to what has been reported. And the first thing is that the nature of the issues that are being reported. Some issues that would historically reported, such as cases of theft or abuse of company time or HR-related matters, we've seen a subtle change in terms of what is recently being reported. Now we're seeing a lot more sophistication in issues that are being reported, behavioral issues that are now being reported. We're seeing a lot more now economic crimes that are being reported, where traditionally those crimes would have been very difficult to see. However, with people working remotely, people are starting to see new things that have never been seen before. Furthermore, what we're also seeing is that the types of people that are reporting. In these cases, the people that are reporting are those that have access to facilities that are able to reach the whistleblowing mechanism fairly quickly, and those that are able to articulate their stories better. Meaning that some other people are actually not being reached because of the environment that we're working in. In addition to that, the types of feedback that we're getting as far as it relates to the way in which people respond, we find that because people are working in an environment where they are a little bit more removed from some of the people or the corruption that they want to report, they are now much more comfortable to actually pick up the phone and make that call. Whereas historically, people that are much more closer and the people that are more in contact would have found it more difficult to report because of the risk of being victimization, because they were seen around that environment.
So following on from that, have you noticed a difference in the way people in the different countries in Africa report allegations? So for example, do some countries report more than others or use different mechanisms?
Yes, we have seen differences in the way in which different African countries report fraud and corruption. However, it's quite interesting to know that, when you look at the African continent itself, the culture of blowing the whistle has existed actually much longer than other global communities, because they normally are not used to this. So generally in Africa, we are a lot more advanced as far as reporting these issues, and we have a much more better system that supports these countries. However, what you will see is that in various African countries, depending on the environment and the infrastructure that is available for them, it still provides for a different way. For example, in some of the still emerging African countries, the number one way of reporting fraud and corruption within their systems is mainly based on technologies and so on. Whereas in other much more evolving areas within Africa, the countries or the organizations have been sophisticated enough to be able to digitalize the way in which people report. Like, for example, you might have some areas within Central Africa that are still way behind. And in other cases, what we've seen is that people still are writing letters to the police, for example, to report fraud, corruption, because they do not trust their own companies with dealing with such cases. Whereas in other areas, approaching the police or the law enforcement agencies is actually a far removed concept, because they want to remove themselves. So they rely on having an anonymous whistleblowing mechanism in that regard. So there are differences depending on the infrastructure that's available. And also what happens is that the ability for law enforcement agencies to deal with these matters influences a lot, which with regards to the nature of how people report these matters.
My last question to you on this topic, and we could go on for hours, but to boost transparency and accountability through a whistleblowing mechanism, how do you change the culture in organizations?
To improve transparency in any environment where people are free to blow the whistle, what is important there is the tone at the top. Stakeholders, employees, service providers that are brave enough that have the capability to spend their time in actually blowing the whistle needs to know that whistleblowing mechanism hotline, for example, is working, is functional, is going to respect their requirements to stay anonymous if they choose so, and also that the information that is being reported on will be acted on. And that is squarely on the tone at the top, on the leaders of those particular entities, to make sure that not only do they give confidence that this whistleblowing mechanism will be functional, that they will actually do something about it. And furthermore, the accountability part is that they will take accountability for not only acting on issues that are being reported, but also acting on acting on the recommendations that come from investigating such issues and actually hold people accountable. And one of the ways in which people actually demonstrate accountability without actually playing lip service to it is to actually demonstrate that people will be disciplined when they're found wanting. Suppliers will be removed from the database if ever they are found to be part of some fraudulent scheme. And furthermore, action will be taken, and drastic action will be taken to change businesses, to change internal controls, and to change processes that are open and that are weak in actually making sure that the integrity is maintained within the business. And companies, what we've seen that actually have been successful in not only showing transparency and accountability is that they have been able to demonstrate that it's everybody within the business, and everybody who's connected within the business is held accountable to making sure that fraud and corruption is uprooted from any business. One important considerations that companies and organizations have to take into account in making sure that there is a transparent and accountable and effective whistleblowing mechanism is to make sure that there is protection of data that is shared from whistleblowers, taking into account that people do not only blow the whistle by phoning a hotline, but they can also blow the whistle by having a conversation with some of the leaders within the business. So the protection of certain data becomes quite critical in any organization that wants to promote an effective whistleblowing mechanism. it has happened many times that companies that actually fail to protect the identities of whistleblowers sometimes find themselves in a situation where they would have to find a way of guarding those individuals from victimizations because their details have been exposed in that regard. And similarly, during investigation processes where people are being spoken to and identities of individuals become exposed, it can often happen that that data that should not have been shared inevitably gets shared, and as a result, it just causes damage within the environment internally, and sometimes with suppliers and service providers that serve the company. So it is important that whoever manages any whistleblowing mechanism and whoever reacts to issues that come from the whistleblowing mechanism and whoever actually takes action against those recommendations that come from investigations that may happen from such cases takes the data and information that is provided with utmost importance and with due care.
Thank you, Caleb. Your comment about data privacy actually is a good link into my next question. And it reminds us yet again that organizations should increase the focus on cyber and data protection. The COVID-19 crisis has heightened the risk of cyber breaches given the increased reliance on the internet and remote working. However, our survey suggests that companies believe they are making progress with implementing data protection policies and practices. From the results on your screen, it's evident that African respondents have reflected that their organization acknowledges the importance of data protection and has retained the necessary skills and resources to address this risk, and are more likely than their counterparts in other parts of the world to have been trained, be it against data security breaches or on data privacy legislation as well. So, such as GDPR or the local legislation for example, in South Africa, the Protection of Personal Information Act, or the Nigerian legislation, NDPR. So, Linus, several African countries have privacy-related legislation in place and are in progress. And despite the results from the survey from our African respondents saying that they're comfortable with their data protection journey, there is this perception that Africa is lagging behind in this area. Can you provide us with some clarity in this regard? How are countries such as Nigeria faring in terms of implementing and rolling out against related legislation?
Thank you, Sharon, for this question. I think the first point that needs repeating is that Africa is a continent, not a country. It is a continent that comprises 54 countries. There is often the tendency to paint Africa with the brush of a country and without due consideration of the peculiarities of the different countries in it. Having said this, turning to data privacy legislation, I agree with you that many African countries have enacted data privacy legislation or regulations or are at the different stages of doing so. But suffice it to say that the major markets on the continent have data protection legislation or regulations in place. And I mean countries such as Nigeria, South Africa, Kenya, Egypt, Ghana, Côte d'Ivoire, Mauritius, Morocco, and Tunisia. All of these countries have data privacy legislation or regulations in place. However, there have been varied results in terms of implementation. I understand that in South Africa, for instance, the regulatory enforcement powers under POPIA came into effect on 1st of July 2021, and the SA regulator has started churning out guidance notes and notices. I am also aware that the regulatory authorities in Kenya have issued some draft regulations to give effect to the Data Protection Act of 2019, which came into effect in November 2019. Turning to Nigeria in particular, the regulator in Nigeria called NITDA released the Nigeria Data Protection Regulation on the 25th of January 2019. NDPR qualifies as what lawyers will call a subsidiary legislation because it was not enacted directly by the Parliament. Rather, it was released by the regulator pursuant to the act enacted by the Parliament. However, there is currently a bill that is pending before the Parliament, which is aimed at elevating data protection regulation to the status of an act of parliament. NDPR compares to most data protection regulation in terms of its provisions. However, it also contains unique provisions which are not present in most data protection regulations. For instance, the NDPR generally mandates organizations, that is data controllers generally, to undertake annual audits of their data privacy program. You don't find such a requirement in most regulations in other countries. The affected organizations are required to also submit the results of the audits to the regulator. However, depending on the number of data subjects whose personal data are processed by the organization in question. Another unique provision of the NDPR is that it makes provision for licensing of data protection compliance organizations, DPCOs, by the regulator. DPCOs are firms that are licensed by the regulator and authorized to provide data protection and data privacy related services to organizations. These unique provisions have contributed to increased awareness of the NDPR. There has been steady increase in terms of the number of organizations that perform the annual audit of their data privacy program. I will also say that the Nigerian regulator has adopted a carrot and stick approach in terms of implementation and enforcement, but it generally leans towards encouraging organizations to comply with the NDPR. On a few occasions, it has wielded the stick. For example, on the 17th of August this year, it imposed a fine of 10 million naira on an online lending company for data privacy violations. Thank you very much.
So following on from that, Linus, in terms of adhering to data privacy related legislation, how do organizations that have a global footprint compare in relation to local organizations?
That's an interesting perspective, Sharon, and I think one can categorize the organizations into three. One will be companies that have multinationals as their parent companies. What I mean by that, for instance, in the case of Nigerian companies that are subsidiaries of international organizations, the multinationals. You also have the Nigerian companies that operate internationally. Then you have the locals who just feel more comfortable playing in the local market without internationalizing their operations. And that also reflects in the way they have also approached the data privacy program. For those companies that are part of multinationals, obviously they are influenced by their parent company. So they tend to mirror what the parent companies are doing or have done. What you also look at those companies that internationalize their operation, i.e., that operate outside of their own jurisdiction. Those ones try also as much as possible to comply with data privacy regulation because of the potential impact, for instance, such as the European Union GDPR. For those purely local players, it's a different ballgame altogether. Those ones, it's a mixed bag, but generally they don't tend to take a data privacy regulation seriously. That would be my own assessment of the three categories. Thank you, Sharon.
Thanks, Linus. So from your feedback, it's evident that some African countries have progressed in terms of data privacy, but there's a way to go. And it's yet again a reminder that getting cybersecurity and data privacy right is key to disrupting cybercrime and corruption. Since the start of the pandemic, we have seen a significant surge in cyber-related attacks. The business world rapidly evolved pretty much overnight, and so did the cyber criminals and their strategies. Cybercrime has become a top threat in any organization's risk universe, and these days you're considered fortunate if you haven't been a victim of some sort of cybercrime, be it as an organization or even in your personal capacity. But one must actually ask whether you just didn't pick it up. As I mentioned, we have recently witnessed some high-profile incidents, operations being negatively affected by cyber attacks for weeks or days. This in addition to reputations also being damaged due to the response to the incident or attack. So ransomware and phishing have become are common forms and have actually become very predominant during this pandemic. So just a reminder, ransomware is when systems or networks are held ransom by having an encryption applied and access is only restored upon payment, and then the decryption key will be provided to you. And we've seen incidents of this over the world, recent incidents, both in Europe and in the States. And those are the only incidents that we know about because they've been in the media. Increased cyber incidents has heightened the need for cyber resilience and the planning and preparation thereof. To mitigate cyber-related risk, it's necessary to implement a culture of cybersecurity awareness. This includes mitigating vulnerabilities and proactively preventing, monitoring, and detecting cyber-related incidents. An example of a preventative measure in this space would be having a robust cyber incident response plan, which effectively provides a detailed approach on how organizations address and manage cyber attacks and incidents. Another example is protecting and strengthening virtual infrastructure by introducing additional security protocols and monitoring standards to understand and identify associated vulnerabilities. The objective with these related proactive initiatives is to minimize the risk, reduce the recovery time and expenses, and be able to continue with business as usual as much as possible. The reality is, if an organization hasn't got sufficient cyber-related controls, policies, skilled resources, and governance in place, they simply aren't taking cybercrime and potential attacks seriously. And lastly, once you think as an organization that you've got the right controls in place, the right policies and action plans in place, why not test them in action and conduct a simulation exercise? So we've spoken about the negatives of having cyber and technology, but most of us have first-hand hard experience as how technology has evolved and assisted us actually in enhancing compliance and investigations, especially during the pandemic and where we've been unable to travel. Advanced technology, obviously given that it's got the correct security around it, is part of an effective compliance program to monitor business activity and flag potential risk areas. So Caleb, with your recent client engagements, especially during the pandemic, has technology, in your view, disrupted corruption?
Good question, Sharon. We are seeing an increasing number of organizations who are prepared to invest in digital tools to help them fight the risk of fraud and corruption in their environment. The ones that have done so are using these tools to help them analyze things such as big data, for example, or structured and unstructured information. But some of them have actually evolved and matured to a point where they've embedded these tools in their day-to-day operations, allowing them to proactively identify red flags in their processes. Some use these tools to collaborate better, and such collaboration allows them to have better outcomes on their forensic initiatives. Not so long ago was it unheard that one would be able to perform a forensic investigation remotely. But these days, under these conditions, these are some of the things that technology has allowed a lot of our forensic professionals to do. Another observation that we've identified is that these tools and the investment in such digital methods is also linked to certain industries. For example, those that are operating in highly regulated environments, such as your financial services companies and so on, you find that, they are quite well ahead in terms of, having these tools embedded in their business and using them on a day-to-day basis. However, a lot of sectors and industries are well behind. Government, public sector, spending is being reprioritized. Even in the telecommunications industry, where you would expect that such innovation would be leading, we find that such entities are still way behind as far as, incorporating digital tools into their day-to-day activities. So there's the room for improvement there. However, even those that have these tools in their businesses, we find that the tools are only as good as the individuals and the resources that are looking at and using these tools. And that's where we're finding that the evolution and the learning of forensic examiners in using these tools effectively is quite poor. In fact, the technology is moving faster than the ability of our forensic examiners to keep up with them. So it is critical that when organizations improve and start investing in digital tools, our people are also empowered and trained to make use of these tools to better manage the risk of fraud and corruption in their environment, and actually proactively position themselves where they are able to have the business help them identify fraud and corruption as they evolve in their integrity journey.
So thank you, Caleb. There's no doubt, and if you have a look at on the screen as well, about how organizations need to progress in terms of their technology journey, especially with the pandemic. It has forced many organizations to look at technology, whether it's in compliance or investigations. I'm sure, like you, we'd expect organizations to be doing more in future. So the last pillar I would like to talk about today, in the time permitted, is third parties and third-party issues being adequately addressed. There's no sense that organizations make efforts to improve integrity, but if they don't take third parties on their journey, it will be undermined if third parties engage in unethical conduct. The EY survey revealed that many businesses operating in emerging markets are aware of this threat. In countries like Kenya and South Africa, respondents were more likely to be confident in third-party conduct than in other emerging markets. This may be, as previously mentioned, due to the heightened awareness of cases where organizations have been publicly named and shamed, with the ensuing fallout due to their interactions with third parties. In some instances, they haven't even been criminally charged for this conduct. We've certainly seen clients in Africa enhancing their third-party due diligence processes in the past couple of years to respond to this risk. Also, by far the most offences under the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, the US FCPA, still relate to organizations' interactions with third parties. This is no exception in Africa. So, Linus, what initiatives do organizations implement in relation to identifying third-party risk or third-party relationships? How is this assisting in eliminating fraud and corruption?
Thank you very much again, Sharon. I think the point you made before about due diligence says it all. In terms of third-party relationship management, the key thing for me is to be able to, first of all, know who you are dealing with. If the third party you are dealing with says he is Mr. A, are you convinced that he is Mr. A? And that is where the third-party due diligence comes in. There are various facets to third-party due diligence, whether it is just the normal background searches, in which case you want to know who are the people behind the company or the entity that you are dealing with, who are the owners, who are the people that form the management. That is very, very important, because it is the people that are behind an organization that obviously will be the eyes, the ears, and the legs of the organization. You also talk about integrity due diligence, which is basically going beyond just knowing who those people are, to also looking at their track record, their business ethic profile, the way they have done businesses in the past, the reputation they have built for themselves, are there adverse media against them in the public domain that you want to be aware of. But suffice it to say that the overall objective of this third-party relationship management or due diligence, as the case may be, is that it helps the organizations to know who they are dealing with. For instance, are you dealing with your own employees under the guise of suppliers or vendors, which will obviously impact the undisclosed conflicts of interest? Are you dealing with the right caliber of people? Are you dealing with the people that you want to deal with, i.e., are you dealing with undesirable elements that can pose risk to your organization? These are, for me, various things that the companies should be interested in knowing, and that is where third-party relationship management comes in. You also look at how the people you are dealing with can actually make or mar your own organization, because there's a saying in my part of the world that tell me who your friends are and I will tell you who you are. It assists in eliminating fraud and corruption in the sense that if the organization that is undertaking the third-party due diligence, for instance, is very conscious or very mindful of ensuring that it is not adversely impacted, obviously the results of the third-party due diligence, for instance, will help the company in question to make informed decisions. But suffice it to also say that there are some companies that are willing to deal with anybody, irrespective of the track record. Such organizations may not be the one that we are talking about. I think we are focusing on those organizations that are mindful of who they are dealing with. That are very committed to curbing the risk of bribery, the risk of fraud and corruption to their own business. Such third-party due diligence exercises obviously will help such a company a lot. And I have had a first-hand experience of that, having worked for a couple of organizations in terms of assisting them with their due diligence exercises.
Thank you, Linus. So it sounds like there's a lot afoot in relation to considering third-party risk. And I guess organizations on the continent need to be innovative on how they deal with the different range of third parties, because not one size fits all. Your third parties could range from multinationals to a small one-person vendor. So in conclusion, the reality is that businesses will always face risks to their integrity. Boards and senior management must convey to their entire organization that improving integrity is vital, not only because it keeps you out of trouble and you don't get fines, and it keeps you out of the newspaper headlines, but because it is actually the right thing to do. Once again, thank you, Caleb, and thank you, Linus, for joining me today and providing me such interesting perspectives of what you are seeing in our geography. I hope you found the discussion informative, and I hope you also obtained some actionable insights on how to encourage employees to report misconduct, enhance your data protection, and effectively manage third-party integrity issues. The last slide, which I'm not going to go through in a lot of detail, should provide you with a summary of the key takeaways from the discussion that we had this afternoon or today. Warren Buffett once said, in looking for people to hire, look for 3 qualities: integrity, intelligence, and energy. And if they don't have the first, the other 2 will kill you. The COVID pandemic is a test for business integrity. Those who pass will differentiate themselves, but those who fail are likely to be held accountable after this crisis is passed by unforgiving stakeholders, especially the public. So this concludes the panel discussion. We're now ready to take questions. And if you require access to any of the material, please reach out to the ACFE. Thank you all.